What happens when a man who has lost everything takes a simple job to forget his past? For Cole Thompson, a lonely rancher haunted by ghosts fixing a leaky roof was just supposed to be a week's work. He never imagined the woman who hired him, Isabella Rossi, was living in the shadow of a dangerous secret. He thought he was just patching shingles, but he was about to find himself in a battle for her home, her safety, and a future he'd long since given up on. This isn't just a story about fixing a house. It's about rebuilding a life from the ashes, one nail, one secret, and one impossible choice at a time. The Montana sky was a vast, unforgiving canvas of pale blue stretched taut over the endless expanse of the prairie. For Cole Thompson, it was a daily reminder of his own insignificance, a cosmic joke played out in acres of swaying grass and the distant, jagged teeth of the Beartooth Mountains. His ranch, the Triple Creek, once a bustling hub of life and laughter, had fallen silent. The silence was a physical presence, a weight that settled in his chest and made the simple act of breathing feel like a chore. It was the silence of loss, the echo of a life that had been violently and irrevocably snuffed out. 2 years. It had been 2 years since the screech of tires on a rain-slicked highway had stolen his wife Sarah and their 7-year-old daughter Lily. One moment he was a husband and a father, his world defined by small hands clutching his, and the scent of Sarah's apple pie cooling on the windowsill. The next he was just Cole. A man adrift in a sea of memories, the Triple Creek, his own private ghost town. The cattle had been the first to go. He couldn't stand the sight of the calves frolicking in the fields, a stark contrast to the crushing stillness in the small, empty bedroom down the hall from his own. He sold the herd to a neighboring rancher, a man named Bill Jensen, who had offered his condolences with a sad shake of his head and a pitying look that made Cole's skin crawl. Then went the horses save for his own steady gelding, Apollo. The barn once filled with the warm, earthy scent of hay, and animals now smelled of dust and decay. His days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of waking, tending to the few remaining chores, and then staring into the bottom of a whiskey bottle until the jagged edges of his grief were sufficiently dulled. He was a shell of the man he once was, his once powerful frame, now gaunt, his face a road map of sorrow. His friends had tried at first. They'd brought casseroles and offered shoulders to cry on, but Cole had pushed them all away, retreating into the fortress of his grief until they finally stopped coming. He was an island, and the moat was filled with his own despair. It was on a particularly bleak Tuesday morning, the kind where the sky mirrored the greyness in his soul, that the phone rang. The sound was so foreign, so intrusive, that he almost didn't answer it. He let it ring, the shrill electronic shriek, a violation of the sacred silence. But on the 5th ring, a flicker of something, curiosity perhaps, or just a desperate need for a distraction, propelled him to his feet. "Yeah," he grunted, his voice rough from disuse. A woman's voice, hesitant and soft, came through the receiver. "I'm looking for a Mr. Cole Thompson. I was given your name by Bill Jensen." Cole's grip on the phone tightened. "Jensen?" The man with the pitying eyes. What did he want? This is him. "My name is Isabella Rossi," the woman said. "Mr. Jensen said you do odd jobs, handyman work." Cole almost laughed. A handyman? Was that what he was? Now, a man who had once run a 1,000-acre ranch, now reduced to fixing leaky faucets and patching fences for strangers. The irony was a bitter pill. "What do you need?" "It's my roof," she explained, her voice gaining a little more confidence. "It was damaged in that hailstorm last month. It's pretty bad. I've got buckets all over the upstairs. I was wondering if you could take a look." He should have said no. He should have hung up the phone and retreated back into the comforting numbness of his solitude. But something in her voice, a fragile thread of desperation, resonated with a part of him he thought had long since died. Or maybe it was just the thought of doing something anything other than sitting and staring at the four walls of his empty house. "Where are you located?" he asked, his voice still gruff. She gave him directions to a place he vaguely knew, an old, isolated homestead about 20 miles north, tucked away in a small, forgotten valley. The Blackwood place it used to be called. He hadn't realized anyone was even living out there anymore. "I can be there this afternoon," he found himself saying the words, tasting strange in his mouth. "Oh, thank you," she said, the relief in her voice palpable. "Thank you so much, Mr. Thompson." He hung up the phone and stood for a long moment, the silence of the house rushing back in to fill the void. An odd job. Fixing a roof. It was a temporary reprieve, a fleeting distraction from the gaping wound in his soul. But as he grabbed his worn tool belt and headed for the door, a small, unfamiliar flicker of something that felt dangerously like purpose ignited within him. He told himself it was just about the money, a way to keep from dipping further into the savings he'd been slowly depleting. But deep down, he knew it was something more. It was a chance to step outside the prison of his own making, if only for a little while. He just didn't realize that the roof he was about to fix was not the only thing in desperate need of repair. He drove his beat-up Ford truck down the long, winding dirt road, the dust kicking up behind him like a plume of smoke. The landscape was raw and untamed, a place where civilization felt like a distant rumor. As he turned onto the final stretch of road, leading to the old Blackwood place, he saw it. The house was a 2-story Victorian, a relic from another era. Its once grand facade, now faded and peeling. The porch sagged in the middle, and several windows were boarded up. It looked like a place that had given up a mirror of his own defeated spirit. And then he saw her. She was standing on the porch, a small, slender figure silhouetted against the decaying grandeur of the house. As he got closer, he could make out her features. She had long, dark hair that fell in waves around her shoulders, and her eyes, even from a distance, seemed to hold a deep, soulful sadness that he recognized immediately. It was the same sadness that stared back at him from the mirror every morning. She was dressed simply in worn jeans and a faded flannel shirt, but she held herself with a quiet dignity, a strength that seemed at odds with her fragile appearance. "Mr. Thompson," she called out, her voice, a soft melody that seemed to be carried on the wind. "Call me Cole," he said, his voice gruff as he stepped out of the truck. She gave him a small, hesitant smile. "Isabella." He nodded his gaze, sweeping over the house, taking in the full extent of the damage. The roof was a mess, a patchwork of missing and broken shingles. It was a big job, bigger than he had anticipated. It would take at least a week, maybe more. "It's bad, I know," she said, as if reading his thoughts. The last owner. He didn't believe in maintenance. Cole grunted in response, his eyes still fixed on the roof. He could see where the water had seeped in, staining the siding and causing the wood to rot. The whole structure looked unstable, a disaster waiting to happen. "I can fix it," he said, the words coming out with more confidence than he felt. "But it's not going to be easy." "I know," she said, her gaze meeting his. "But I don't have a choice. This is all I have." There it was again, that undercurrent of desperation in her voice. He looked at her, then really looked at her, and saw past the sadness to the fierce determination in her eyes. She was a fighter, he could see that. Just like him, or at least the man he used to be. "Let's take a look inside," he said, his voice a little softer this time. She led him through the front door and into a house that was even more dilapidated than the exterior. The wallpaper was peeling, the floorboards creaked with every step, and the air was thick with the smell of damp and decay. But there were signs of life, too. A vase of wild flowers on a rickety table, a stack of books by a worn armchair, a half-finished painting on an easel in the corner. It was a house that was being loved, despite its flaws. Upstairs, the damage was even worse. Buckets were scattered across the floor, catching the steady drip of water from the ceiling. The plaster was stained and crumbling, and a large section of the ceiling in one of the bedrooms had collapsed entirely. "I'm sorry for the mess," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not your fault," he said, his voice gentle. He ran a hand over the damp wall, his mind already calculating the cost of materials, the hours of labor it would take to make this place habitable again. It was a monumental task, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of something that wasn't despair. He felt challenged. "I'll need to get some supplies," he said, turning to face her. "I can start tomorrow morning." A look of profound relief washed over her face. "Thank you, Cole. I don't know how to thank you." "Just pay me when the job's done," he said, his voice returning to its usual gruffness. He wasn't comfortable with gratitude. It was an emotion he hadn't felt worthy of in a very long time. As he drove away from the old Blackwood place, the image of Isabella's face, her sad, beautiful eyes, stayed with him. He told himself it was just a job, a way to pass the time. But as the miles stretched out behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was driving toward something more than just a paycheck. He was driving toward a woman who was just as broken as he was, a house that was a reflection of their shattered lives. And for the first time in 2 years, he felt a flicker of hope, a tiny, fragile flame in the vast, empty darkness of his soul. He was just a lonely rancher, hired to fix a roof. He had no idea he was about to rebuild a life. The next morning, Cole arrived with the rising sun, his truck laden with lumber shingles, and a quiet determination. The air was crisp, holding the last chill of the night, and the world was painted in the soft hues of dawn. Isabella was already waiting on the porch, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, which she offered to him with another of her small, hesitant smiles. "I didn't know if you were a coffee drinker," she said, her voice a little stronger than the day before. "I am," he said, accepting the mug. The warmth spread through his hands, a small comfort against the morning air. "Thanks." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the valley. It was a comfortable silence, a shared understanding of the quiet solitude that both of them seemed to inhabit. "The hardware store in Big Timber had most of what I need," he said, breaking the silence. "Should be enough to get a good start, at least. Let me know what I owe you for the materials," she said, her gaze fixed on the mountain peaks in the distance. "We can settle up when the job's done," he said, his standard reply. He wasn't in this for the money, not really. The truth was, he didn't know why he was here. He just knew he had to be. He spent the morning on the roof, tearing off the old rotted shingles, the rhythmic thump of his hammer, the only sound in the still air. It was hard physical work, the kind of work that left his muscles aching and his mind blissfully empty. He could lose himself up here, high above the world, with only the sky and the wind for company. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Around noon, Isabella called up to him, her voice a welcome interruption to his solitary labor. "I've made some lunch if you're hungry." He climbed down the ladder, his stomach rumbling in agreement. She had set up a small table on the porch with 2 plates of sandwiches and a pitcher of iced tea. It was a simple meal, but it felt like a feast to him. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "It's the least I can do," she said, taking a seat across from him. "You're saving my house." He shrugged, uncomfortable with her praise. "Just doing my job." They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the chirping of birds and the gentle rustle of the wind in the trees. He found himself studying her, trying to piece together the puzzle of the woman who lived in this broken-down house in the middle of nowhere. She had a quiet grace about her, a gentle spirit that seemed to be at war with the sadness in her eyes. He wondered what her story was, what had brought her to this place of solitude and decay. "So what brought you out to Montana?" He asked the question, slipping out before he could stop it. It was more than he had said to anyone in months. She looked up from her plate, her eyes guarded. "I needed a change of scenery." It was a non-answer, a polite way of telling him to mind his own business. He should have let it go, but he couldn't. There was a story there, he knew it. A story that was as heavy and as suffocating as his own. "It's a big change from wherever you're from." He pressed his curiosity, getting the better of him. A shadow passed over her face. "San Francisco." The name of the city hung in the air between them, a world away from the rugged wilderness of Montana. He couldn't imagine her in a place like that, a city of noise and crowds and concrete. She belonged here in the quiet solitude of the mountains, like a wildflower that had somehow managed to bloom in the most unlikely of places. "That's a long way from home," he said, his voice gentle. "This is my home now," she said, her voice firm, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as him. He could see the walls going up, the emotional barriers she had erected to protect herself from the world. He knew those walls well. He lived behind them himself. He decided to change the subject, to retreat to safer ground. "This house," he said, gesturing with his half-eaten sandwich. "It's got good bones. Must have been something in its day." A genuine smile touched her lips, and for a moment the sadness in her eyes receded. "It was. It was built by my great-grandfather. He was a cattle baron, one of the first in this valley. So it's been in your family all this time?" She nodded. "It was passed down to my mother. She loved this place. She used to tell me stories about growing up here, about the wild horses that used to run free in the valley." Her voice trailed off, and the sadness returned, a cloud obscuring the sun. "She passed away a few years ago. The house, it was left to a distant cousin. He's the one who let it go to ruin." "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, the words feeling inadequate, a hollow echo of the condolences he had received after Sarah and Lily were gone. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I bought it back from him a few months ago. I wanted to restore it, to bring it back to life. For her." He understood then. This wasn't just a house to her. It was a legacy, a connection to a past that was filled with love and happy memories. It was everything his own house was not. He spent the rest of the afternoon on the roof, working with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fixing a house. He was helping to rebuild a dream. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink, he packed up his tools, his body aching, but his mind clear. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said, his voice gruff as he stood on the porch ready to leave. "Cole," she said, her voice stopping him in his tracks. "Thank you. For everything." He just nodded, unable to find the words to respond. He got in his truck and drove away, the image of her standing on the porch, a solitary figure against the backdrop of the setting sun, seared into his memory. The next few days fell into a comfortable routine. He would arrive early, they would share a cup of coffee on the porch, and then he would spend the day on the roof, the steady rhythm of his work, a balm to his troubled soul. They would eat lunch together, their conversations slowly becoming more frequent, more personal. He learned that she was a painter, that she loved the way the light changed in the valley, that she found a strange beauty in the gnarled, weathered shapes of the ancient trees. She learned that he had once been a rancher, that he had a deep love for the land, that he carried a sadness that was as vast and as empty as the Montana sky. They never spoke of his wife and daughter. He couldn't bring himself to utter their names, to give voice to the grief that was a constant, suffocating presence in his life. And she never asked. It was an unspoken agreement, a silent acknowledgement of the pain they both carried. One afternoon, as he was replacing a section of rotted fascia board, he heard the sound of an engine, a low, guttural roar that was out of place in the peaceful valley. A sleek black Range Rover, its windows tinted to an impenetrable darkness, came speeding down the dirt road, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. It pulled to a stop in front of the house, and a man stepped out of the driver's side. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that was ridiculously out of place in the rustic setting. He had a handsome, predatory face with cold, calculating eyes that seemed to take in everything and give nothing away. He exuded an aura of wealth and power, a sense of entitlement that made Cole's hackles rise. Isabella, who had been tending to her small garden, froze at the sight of him. The color drained from her face, and her body went rigid with fear. It was a fear so raw, so visceral, that Cole felt it like a physical blow. The man's lips curled into a smug, possessive smile as his eyes landed on Isabella. "Hello, Bella," he said, his voice a low, menacing purr that sent a shiver down Cole's spine. "You didn't really think you could hide from me out here, did you?" Isabella didn't answer. She just stood there, her body trembling, her eyes wide with a terror that Cole had never seen before. He dropped his hammer and started to climb down the ladder, his mind racing. Who was this man? And what did he want with Isabella? The man's gaze shifted from Isabella to Cole, his eyes narrowing in a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "And who is this?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "The local help." Cole reached the bottom of the ladder and stood his ground, his body tense, his fists clenched at his sides. He didn't know who this man was, but he knew one thing for certain. He was a threat to Isabella. A threat to the fragile peace that had begun to settle over this broken-down house and the two broken people who were trying to fix it. "The name's Cole," he said, his voice a low growl. "And you're trespassing." The man laughed, a cold, humorless sound that grated on Cole's nerves. "This is my property, you idiot. Or at least it will be once I've dealt with this little misunderstanding." His gaze shifted back to Isabella, his eyes burning with a possessive fire. "We have some unfinished business, Bella, and I've come to collect." Cole stepped forward, placing himself between Isabella and the man. "I think you should leave," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The man's eyes flashed with anger. "And I think you should mind your own damn business before you get hurt." "This is my business," Cole said, his gaze unwavering. He didn't know what was going on, but he knew he couldn't let this man get to Isabella. He had spent the last 2 years running from a fight from life itself, but now standing on the dusty ground of this forgotten valley, he felt something he hadn't felt since the day he lost his family. He felt the need to protect, to defend, to fight. The man who introduced himself as Marcus Vance sneered. "You have no idea what you're getting into, cowboy." "Maybe not," Cole said, his voice as hard as the Montana granite. "But I'm a fast learner." Marcus's eyes blazed with a cold fury, but he seemed to recognize the unyielding resolve in Cole's stance. With a final venomous glare at Isabella, he turned and got back into his Range Rover. "This isn't over, Bella," he snarled before speeding away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy, suffocating silence in his wake. Cole turned to Isabella. She was pale and trembling, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Shame. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice gentle. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. He's my ex-husband." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken history and the weight of a past she had tried so desperately to escape. Cole looked from her terrified face to the dilapidated house, its brokenness suddenly taking on a new, more sinister meaning. He had come here to fix a roof, but he was quickly realizing that the real damage, the real danger, lay not in the rotting timbers of the old house, but in the dark, twisted secrets that were buried within its walls and within the heart of the woman he was just beginning to know. The dust from Marcus Vance's departure settled slowly, coating everything in a fine layer of grime, a physical manifestation of the filth he had left behind. The silence he left in his wake was different from the peaceful solitude that usually enveloped the valley. This was a tense, heavy silence, fraught with fear and unanswered questions. Isabella stood frozen, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold her splintering world together. Cole watched her, his own heart pounding with a protective instinct that was both foreign and fiercely familiar. "Isabella," he said softly, taking a tentative step toward her. "Are you all right?" She flinched at his voice, her eyes wide and haunted. "He shouldn't have been able to find me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was so careful." "What does he want?" Cole asked, his voice low and steady, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. She finally looked at him, her eyes swimming with tears. She refused to let fall. "The ranch? He wants the ranch." Cole frowned. "But you said you bought it from your cousin." A single tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "I did. But Marcus, he helped with the money. He called it a loan, an investment. But it wasn't. It was a leash." She took a shaky breath, the story tumbling out of her in a torrent of pain and regret. "We were married for 3 years. In the beginning he was charming, attentive. He swept me off my feet. But it was all an act. He was controlling, manipulative. He isolated me from my friends, my family. He made me feel like I was nothing without him." Her voice broke, and Cole's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He knew that kind of emotional abuse. He'd seen it before in the wife of a neighboring rancher years ago. A woman who had slowly faded, her light extinguished by the constant corrosive drip of her husband's cruelty. When my mother died, Isabella continued, her voice barely audible. All I could think about was coming back here to the one place I had ever felt safe. Marcus saw it as another opportunity, another property to add to his portfolio. He offered to buy it for me, to help me restore it. I was so desperate to escape, to have this one piece of my mother back, that I agreed. I signed papers without reading them, without thinking. I just wanted to be free. And now he's calling in the debt. Cole finished the pieces of the puzzle, clicking into place. She nodded, a wave of shame washing over her face. The papers I signed, they weren't a loan agreement. They made him a co-owner. He says that if I can't pay him back the full amount with his exorbitant interest, the entire property defaults to him. He knows I don't have that kind of money. He's trying to force me out, to take the one thing I have left. Cole's jaw tightened. It was a classic predatory move, a legal trap disguised as generosity. "We need to see a lawyer." "I've already spoken to one," she said, her voice filled with despair. "He said the contract is ironclad. Marcus has the best lawyers money can buy. They made sure of it. My only chance is to pay him what he says I owe him, and I have less than a month to do it." "How much?" Cole asked, his voice grim. She named a figure that made his stomach drop. It was an astronomical sum, far more than the ranch was worth in its current state. It was a sum designed to be impossible to pay. "He doesn't just want the ranch, does he?" Cole said, his eyes searching hers. "He wants you." She looked away, her silence a confirmation. "He can't stand that I left him, that I chose this," she said, gesturing to the broken-down house, the untamed wilderness around them. "To him, it's an insult. He wants to see me broken, to see me crawl back to him. Taking this place, it's how he plans to do it." A cold, hard anger settled in Cole's chest. He had spent 2 years running from the world, from his own pain. But now, faced with Isabella's quiet desperation, with the calculated cruelty of a man like Marcus Vance, something inside him shifted. The apathy that had held him captive for so long began to recede, replaced by a fierce, protective fire. "He's not taking this ranch," Cole said, his voice a low, determined growl. "Not without a fight." The next few days were a blur of activity. Cole threw himself into the work on the house with a feverish intensity, his hammer blows a physical manifestation of his anger. He worked from sunup to sundown, his muscles screaming in protest, but he welcomed the pain. It was a distraction from the turmoil in his mind, from the fear that he could see growing in Isabella's eyes. She in turn threw herself into her own work, her painting. She set up her easel in the living room, the one room that was relatively dry, and painted with a desperate energy, her canvases filled with stark, beautiful landscapes that seemed to mirror the turmoil in her soul. It was her way of fighting back, of creating beauty in the face of ugliness. They worked in a strange, silent partnership, 2 wounded souls finding solace in the shared act of creation. In the evenings they would sit on the porch, the silence between them no longer just comfortable, but filled with a new unspoken intimacy. He would tell her stories about his ranch, about the rhythms of the seasons, about the satisfaction of a hard day's work. She would tell him about her art, about the way she saw the world, about the colors and textures that filled her imagination. They were dancing around the edges of their own pain, careful not to tread on the raw, unhealed wounds that lay just beneath the surface. But with each passing day, the walls between them began to crumble, brick by brick. Marcus did not stay away for long. A few days after his initial visit, a letter arrived, delivered by a courier. It was from his lawyer, a formal, threatening document that outlined the terms of the contract and gave Isabella a deadline. 30 days. If she couldn't produce the money by then, eviction proceedings would begin. The letter was a cold, hard slap in the face, a reminder that their fragile peace was living on borrowed time. Isabella retreated into herself, the light in her eyes dimming once more. Cole felt a surge of helpless fury. He was a rancher, a handyman. He knew how to fix things, how to build things. But he didn't know how to fight a man like Marcus Vance, a man who wielded power and money like weapons. That night, as a storm rolled in over the mountains, mirroring the tempest in their hearts, the power went out. They were plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the flickering flames of a few candles and the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the room in stark, dramatic relief. "He's going to win, isn't he?" Isabella said, her voice a small, defeated sound in the darkness. Cole looked at her, at the way the candlelight softened the lines of her face, at the vulnerability in her eyes, and in that moment, something inside him broke. The dam of grief he had so carefully constructed for 2 years finally burst. "I know what it's like to lose everything," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. He told her then about Sarah and Lily, about the accident, about the crushing, all-consuming guilt that had been his constant companion ever since. He told her about the silence, the emptiness, the feeling that his life had ended that day on the highway. She listened, her eyes never leaving his, her hand reaching out to find his in the darkness. She didn't offer platitudes or empty words of comfort. She just held his hand. Her touch, a silent acknowledgement of his pain, a shared understanding of a grief that was too deep for words. "I'm so sorry, Cole," she whispered. Her voice filled with a genuine, heartfelt compassion that soothed a part of his soul he thought was beyond healing. In that moment, in the flickering candlelight of a broken-down house with a storm raging outside and the threat of a different kind of storm on the horizon, 2 broken people found a moment of connection, a shared humanity that was more powerful than any contract, any threat. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh. The sun shone with a renewed brilliance, and for the first time in a long time, Cole felt a glimmer of hope. He still didn't know how they were going to fight Marcus, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let Isabella face him alone. He had come to this valley to fix a roof, a simple, straightforward job. But now he was embroiled in a battle for a woman's home, for her future. He was no longer just a handyman. He was a protector, a defender. And as he climbed the ladder to the roof, his hammer in his hand, he felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. He was not just rebuilding a house, he was rebuilding a life. His own. And he would be damned if he was going to let anyone, not even a man as powerful and as ruthless as Marcus Vance, tear it all down. The siege of Blackwood Ranch had begun, and Cole Thompson, the lonely rancher who had given up on life, was ready for a fight. The lawyer's letter was a declaration of war. The thick, creamy paper felt obscene in its quality, a stark contrast to the rustic simplicity of their lives. Marcus Vance wasn't just a ghost from Isabella's past. He was an invading army, and his weapon of choice was the cold, unfeeling machinery of the law. The 30-day deadline loomed over them like a guillotine, each tick of the clock a countdown to ruin. The fear was a constant, acrid taste in the back of their throats. For the first few nights, neither of them slept. Cole would lie awake in the small guest room she'd cleared for him, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying Marcus's sneering face. He listened to the old house groan and settle around him, each creak of the floorboards, an imagined footstep, each rustle of leaves outside a harbinger of another unwelcome arrival. He could hear Isabella pacing in her room above the soft, restless tread of her feet, a mirror of his own anxiety. The weight of their shared problem was a physical presence in the house, a third occupant that suffocated the fragile peace they had started to build. Cole saw the shift in Isabella on the third night. He'd come downstairs for a glass of water around 2 a.m., unable to quiet the storm in his own mind. The moon was high-painting silver stripes across the living room floorboards through the newly installed windows. He found her there, not pacing, but standing perfectly still before a new massive canvas, the largest he had seen her use. Her face, illuminated by a single work lamp, was a mask of fierce, focused concentration. The despair that had haunted her eyes since the letter arrived was gone, banished and replaced by something harder, something brighter. She had stopped painting the sorrowful, melancholic landscapes. Instead, she had begun to sketch a new vision, with bold, decisive strokes of charcoal, her hand moving with a speed and certainty that was mesmerizing. She was no longer a victim of her circumstances. She was an architect of her own defiance. He watched her for a long moment unseen as she mapped out the image. It was the ranch, but not the broken-down version he saw every day. It was the ranch as an ideal, a promise. The house stood proud and whole, its lines clean and strong, its windows gleaming as if lit from within. The porch, his own handiwork, was straight and inviting. Wild flowers, lupine, Indian paintbrush, black-eyed Susans bloomed in a riot of color in the foreground, and in the distance, under a vast, hopeful sky, a herd of wild horses ran free across the valley, their manes and tails flying in the wind. It was the house from her mother's stories, a vision of hope and resilience made tangible. "It's the future," she said, without turning around, as if she had sensed his presence all along. Her voice, though quiet, was as clear and steady as a church bell. "It's what we're fighting for." The "we" resonated deep in Cole's chest. It was a simple word, but it was a foundation stone. It sealed their pact. He was no longer just a hired hand, a ghost haunting the edges of her life. He was a partner in her struggle, a co-conspirator in her rebellion. Her courage was a spark, and it lit a fire in him that he thought had long since turned to ash. His own work on the house took on a new, almost holy urgency. Every nail he drove was a protest. Every board he replaced was a barricade. He wasn't just repairing a structure, he was fortifying a stronghold. He worked with a meticulous, almost obsessive care. His hands, once the instruments of a rancher's trade, now the tools of a protector. He rebuilt the sagging porch, replaced the last of the boarded-up windows, and began the laborious task of patching the crumbling plaster walls, slowly, painstakingly erasing the physical signs of neglect. Their days fell into a new rhythm, a dance of shared purpose. In the evenings, they would sit on the newly repaired porch, the hated legal document spread between them on a rickety table, their coffee mugs growing cold as they searched for a weakness. "There has to be a loophole," Cole said, for the 10th time, rubbing his tired eyes as he stared at the dense, impenetrable legal jargon. Something his lawyers missed. "They don't miss things, Cole," Isabella said, her voice weary, but not defeated. "They create traps. Every clause is a tooth." "Then we don't fight him on his turf," Cole insisted, slamming his hand on the porch railing, the frustration boiling over into raw anger. The idea that had been simmering in his mind finally came to the surface. "We don't fight him in a courtroom in San Francisco with his slick, high-priced sharks. We fight him here, in our valley." for a man who had isolated himself for 2 years. The thought of asking for help was terrifying. It meant admitting he couldn't do it alone. It meant being vulnerable. But the thought of letting Isabella lose this place of seeing that light in her eyes, extinguished by a man like Marcus, was infinitely worse. He swallowed his pride, that bitter, familiar companion, and picked up the phone. His call to Bill Jensen was short and to the point. He laid out the whole ugly story, the manipulative contract, the impossible sum, the 30-day clock. Jensen listened, his silence on the other end of the line, punctuated only by the occasional grunt. "That's a damn shame," he said. Finally, his voice a low grumble. "That Vance fella sounds like a real piece of work." The Blackwood place. It's been a part of this valley for as long as I can remember. Belongs here. Be a crime to see it fall into the hands of some slick city suit. We need help. Bill Cole said the words, catching in his throat. I don't know what we can do, but we have to do something. Let me make some calls, Jensen said, a note of grim determination in his voice. This valley. We look after our own. The next day, a caravan of dusty pickup trucks rumbled down the long dirt road, kicking up a defiant cloud of dust. It was Jensen, and with him were 2 other ranchers, Gus, a barrel-chested man with a booming laugh, and Earl, who was wiry quiet and missed nothing with his sharp eyes. The men, whose faces were maps of the Montana landscape, walked the property with Cole, their gazes taking in the work he had done. They listened, hats in hand, as Isabella, her voice stronger, now told them her story. This ain't right, Gus said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the dusty ground with surgical precision. A man's home is his castle. Ain't no one got the right to take it from him. Or her. We can't fight his lawyers, Earl said, his voice a slow, deliberate drawl that carried surprising weight. They got more tricks than a rodeo clown. But we can show him what he's up against. He's not just taking on one woman. He's taking on this whole valley. Word spread like a wildfire, passed over fence posts, in the aisles of the feed store, and over beers at the single tavern in Big Timber. People started showing up. Their trucks were filled with supplies, lumber paint bags of concrete, and their hands were ready to work. Jensen and his crew helped Cole finish the roof in a single, long, sun-drenched day of sweat and camaraderie. The women from town, led by Jensen's formidable wife, Martha, brought a feast: casseroles, pies, fresh baked bread, and gallons of iced tea. They set up tables in the yard, and the ranch, once a place of killings and decay, was filled with the sounds of laughter and hammering. The local blacksmith, a giant of a man named Fitz, fired up his portable forge and repaired the twisted, rusted wrought iron gate at the entrance to the ranch, his hammer ringing out a rhythmic anthem of defiance. The Blackwood Ranch was transformed into a bustling hub of activity, a modern-day barn, raising fueled by a shared sense of justice. Cole, who had fled from community, found himself at its heart, directing the work, coordinating the volunteers, his natural leadership skills, long dormant, reawakening. He was no longer just the lonely, grieving rancher. He was the man leading the charge. Isabella blossomed. She moved among the volunteers, her face glowing with a gratitude that was too deep for words. They saw her not as a victim, but as one of their own. A woman of grit and grace who was fighting for her home. But the deadline still loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon. They had rebuilt the ranch, but they still hadn't found a way to defeat Marcus. The breakthrough came from the past. Late one night, with only a week left on the clock, an exhausted Isabella found herself unable to sleep. Seeking a connection to her mother's strength, she began sorting through a large, cedar-lined trunk of her mother's belongings. Beneath layers of linens and dried lavender, she pulled out a thick leather-bound journal. It was her great-grandfather's. She stayed up all night, the house silent around her, reading his elegant looping script. And then she found it, a single entry dated almost 100 years ago, that made her heart stop. The next morning, she came running out to the barn where Cole was working, the journal clutched in her hand, her eyes shining with a wild, triumphant light. "I found it, Cole," she said, her voice breathless. "I found the answer." She showed him the entry. Her great-grandfather, a man of foresight and a deep distrust of banks and speculators, had placed the original deed to the ranch in a land trust. The covenant, written in clear, unambiguous terms, was an iron-clad clause stating that the land and all its assets could never be sold or transferred to any individual or entity outside the direct Blackwood family line, without the unanimous written consent of all living adult descendants. My cousin Isabella whispered, her voice trembling with the enormity of her discovery, the one who sold it to me. He never had the legal right to enter into that agreement with Marcus. He wasn't the sole owner to begin with. The sale was invalid. Marcus. He doesn't own any of it. He never did. Cole stared at the faded ink on the page, the carefully crafted words of a long-dead man reaching across a century to protect his legacy. A slow grin spread across his face, the first genuine, hopeful smile he'd had in years. It was a long shot, a legal argument from a dusty, century-old document. But it was something. It was a weapon. A silver bullet. A weapon Marcus Vance, with all his money and all his high-powered lawyers, would never see coming. "We still need a lawyer," Cole said, his mind already racing, the pieces falling into place. "A good one. Someone who's not afraid to go up against a man like Vance. I know just the man," Jensen said, having overheard their conversation as he walked into the barn, his face breaking into a knowing smile. "Old man Abernathy, over in Bozeman. He's retired now, but he's forgotten more about Montana property law than most lawyers will ever know. He's a cantankerous old badger, but he lives for this kind of fight, and he hates bullies more than he hates anything else." The tide had turned. The siege was not yet over, but for the first time the defenders of Blackwood Ranch had a fighting chance. Cole looked at Isabella, at the fierce, beautiful woman who had inadvertently led him back to the land of the living, and he knew that this was more than just a fight for a piece of land. It was a fight for a future he was starting to believe he might just be a part of. Cole Thompson went to Blackwood Ranch to fix a roof, but he ended up mending the broken pieces of his own soul. He and Isabella, two strangers united by loss, found in each other the strength to fight back against the darkness of the past. Their story is a powerful reminder that home isn't just a place. It's the people who stand with you, the community that rallies around you, and the hope you build together. It proves that even in the face of overwhelming odds, courage and connection can forge a future you never thought possible. If their incredible journey of resilience and love moved you, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs a story of hope. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss our next real-life drama. Thank you for watching.